welcome to this illustrated talk on Wellington Station, gateway of the town. Historically, Wellington Station, the railway station, has been the gateway to and from the town from the time the first train arrived here in 1849 right up to the present day. And this despite competition from road transport that began in the first part of the 20th century, and also the drastic cutback in local rail services in the 1960s that reflected the countrywide decline in rail travel. In fact, over the last few decades, railways have made a remarkable comeback nationally. Wellington Station is part of that success story. The pandemic over the last 12 months or so has, of course, interrupted this growth. In my talk, I'd like to cover some of the highlights in the 170 years of the station's history. On this title slide, notice the crosses on the roof of the main station building and the position of the station in relation to the church. I'll explain all that later. So, to begin at the beginning. On June 1st, 1849, the wine and spirit merchant John Slaney wrote in his diary, "This day I consider one of the most important in the annals of Wellington." He was referring, of course, to the opening of the railway through the town on that day, which enabled people to travel by rail to Shrewsbury and Stafford, and 5 months later to Wolverhampton, which would also bring people and trade into what was becoming the commercial centre of East Shropshire. The rapid increase of the Wellington area's population over the following years was attributed by the 1861 census enumerator to, and I quote, "the establishment of iron foundries, timber yards and sawmills, and to the extension of railway communication." Because in addition to links in 1849 to Shrewsbury, Stafford and Wolverhampton, over the next 18 years Wellington acquired further local rail services to Muchwain Lock, Coalport and Market Drayton, all of which eventually provided links to further beyond. And this extension was in no small part the result of the activities of a number of progressive local businessmen who became involved in various ways with railway development and who, in so doing, helped to expand the economy of the town. First, there was John Slaney, the wine and spirit merchant with premises in Oakengates in Wellington. Slaney had supported projects for a railway from Birmingham to Shrewsbury from as early as 1838, and he campaigned for a station in Wellington near the centre of the town, as opposed to an originally projected site near what is now Morrison's car park. Slaney became a shareholder in 3 local railways, the Shrewsbury and Birmingham, the Shropshire Union and the Wellington and Severn Junction. He also bought shares in railways in other parts of the country. John Dixon, a railway contractor who settled in Wellington, was involved in the building of the line between Shrewsbury and Wellington, and also part of the Wellington and Severn Junction line and the Madeley branch. He set up a line-side railway engineering works in Wellington, later taken over by Groom's Timber Yard. And after mixed fortunes in other parts of the country, following his death, he was buried in Wellington in the churchyard overlooking the line he had helped to build. But perhaps the leading promoter of railways in this area was Thomas Campbell Iple, landowner and prominent town improver. Like his father and grandfather before him, he was involved in the management of the Shrewsbury Canal that ran through the Ipen estate, but he went on to become a director of 3 local railway companies, the Shropshire Union, the Wellington and Severn Junction and the Stafford and Uttoxeter. On the map, first one is the Shropshire Union line between Shrewsbury, Wellington and Stafford. The second one, the Wellington and Severn Junction line with its extension as far as Muchwain Lock. and the third one, the Stafford and New Toxteth Railway. This latter, the Stafford and New Toxteth, though it was over 20 miles away from Wellington, this helped to transport cattle traffic from Shropshire to the East Midlands. And the breeding of cattle was of particular interest to Thomas Campbell Iton. With the increasing desire of people to travel by rail, and following the example of Thomas Cook in the East Midlands, John Hulston, bookseller and auctioneer, spotted the market opportunity in this area for travel. Here he is in his bookshop in the square in Wellington. In the 1850s and 1860s, Hulston organised a number of excursion trains from Wellington and other local stations to destinations in mainland Britain and even further afield, with he himself selling the tickets and often travelling on the train. Here is an example of one of his adverts in the local press. Finally, amongst these 5 local businessmen was John Barber, auctioneer and surveyor, who worked with both Slaney and Iton on railway projects, and like them invested in railway shares. He played a leading role in setting up a new livestock market in Wellington alongside the railway to the west of the station and adjacent to the goods yard. This site had been acquired by the Markets Company from property speculators who had bought up land in the area in the mid-1840s, when it was widely believed it would be the location of the new station. So these then were the men who made their mark on the promotion, construction and management of the railway in and around Wellington in the mid-19th century. In the second half of the century, and in fact right up to the time of the First World War, railway services expanded particularly on the main line. When the Shrewsbury and Birmingham Railway was taken over by the Great Western Railway in 1854, Wellington soon had links with London Paddington via Oxford and with the Mersey via Chester and Birkenhead. An alternative London route was that via Stafford to Euston on London and North Western Railway trains. The immediate impact of these railway developments was noted by William Smith, the tollgate keeper on the Holyhead Road at Burcote, what we now call the Umbrella House. There it is. Smith claimed that the opening of the Shrewsbury and Birmingham Railway was, and I quote, the cause of removing nearly all the traffic from the turnpike roads. And the road that was considered the best in England, namely London to Holyhead, in a few months' time was almost deserted. This is no doubt an exaggeration, but it does reflect the impact of railways on this area. At the hub of the network of railway lines, Wellington became the Clapham junction of East Shropshire, as you can see its central position in this map. In addition to the lines that brought passengers into the town for business and shopping, Wellington residents themselves could not only travel by rail to Coalbrookdale, Matchwinlock and Craven Arms, to Madeley and Coalport, and to Market Drayton and Crewe, and to all the intermediate stations, but they could also take mainline trains to Shrewsbury, Stafford, Wolverhampton and far beyond. In fact, by the time of the 1881 timetable, for example, the Great Western Railway provided six main trains daily, each way on the Paddington-Birkenhead route, and the London and North Western Railway ran 8 daily services each way on the Shrewsbury, Wellington to Stafford route. And both these companies, the Great Western Railway and the London North Western Railway, shared regular services on the local lines into Wellington. We do have some photographic evidence of Wellington Station and the trains that served it in the later 19th century, and in fact right up to the time of the First World War. Here we see a Wellington to Crewe train at Market Drayton in the late 19th century. This locomotive would have been based in Wellington Locomotive Department. Next, the Coalport Dodger in the bay platform at Wellington Station sometime in the 1890s. This one shows a Much Wenlock to Wellington train at Coalbrook Dale station at the turn of the 19th century. This one, dignitaries are awaiting the arrival of Princess Mary Louise at Wellington Station in July 1909. The Princess Marie Louise was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she was on this occasion paying a visit to Alton Hall. Here is a Wellington to Stafford train at Newport Station in 1910. And finally, in this section, a very impressive array of Edwardian station staff at Wellington, very different from today's single booking clerk based at the station. The decade before the First World War is considered to have been the golden age of railway travel. And at this time, in addition to the existing mainline services, Wellington benefited from a new service between Birkenhead and Southampton, operated jointly by the Great Western Railway and the London and South Western Railway. Railways were taken over by the government during the First World War, and soon after they were returned to their independent companies, paring down to 4 large groups was completed. This was the so-called grouping of 1922, which took effect from the 1st of January the following year. An enlarged Great Western Railway, as you can see on this map, still operated the mainline services in this area, together with the local trains on the Much Wenlock Craven Arms line and the Market Drayton to Crewe line. And the newly formed London Midland Scottish Railway, incorporating the former London and North Western Railway, operated services on the Shrewsbury, Wellington, Stafford line and also on the Coalport branch. And here you see one of the early LMS trains at Wellington Station soon after the grouping. During the interwar years, passenger services returned to pre-1914 levels, with some mainline services through Wellington Station extended to Cambrian Coast and South Coast destinations. Trains passing through the station, through Wellington Station, displayed the chocolate and cream carriages of the Great Western Railway on the main line, the Crimson Lake carriages of the London Midland Scottish Railway on the Stafford line, and the olive and later malachite green carriages of the Southern Railway on the small number of trains to the south coast. All these services were well patronised, but numbers of passengers on local services were gradually eroded by the introduction of bus services on local routes. And here you can see one of the early Midland Red services down to Iron Bridge. The Great Western Railway countered this competition from bus services to its passenger traffic with the opening of a number of halts on local lines in the area. And you can see on this map, I've underlined in red the halts that opened by the Great Western Railway during the 1930s on local lines. Starting at the top there, look, the New Hadley halt on the main line, and then on the line down to Ketley, Lightmoor, Bulbus and across to Much Wenlock. Halts were opened at New Ketley halt, Newdale halt, Doseley halt, Greenbank halt, and on the Southern Railway line, a halt down at Jackfield. These were all opened by the Great Western Railway in the 1930s to counter the competition from bus services. Passenger services during the Second World War were badly affected with the movement of freight and munitions, which were obviously given priority. And this heavy use and lack of maintenance during the wartime placed a heavy burden on the railway companies at the end of the war. The state stepped in and the new Labour government nationalised the country's railways in 1948. But looking now at those wartime years, during the war in December 1943, One notable arrival by rail at Wellington Station, who was later to make his name as a distinguished poet, was of course Philip Larkin, coming to take up his post at Wellington Library. And he is. In the following years, Larkin frequently travelled by rail to Shrewsbury to meet a friend who taught at Shrewsbury School. He recorded one such return journey to Wellington when he fell asleep and he missed getting off the train at Wellington Station. How he eventually returned to Wellington is not recorded. Towards the end of the war, I myself remember a train journey I made with my mother from Wellington Station. We travelled on a very long, slow-moving train to Paddington to visit my father, who was at that time based in London, attached to a bomb disposal unit, and was billeted down at Streatham in South London. So at the age of 4, when I made this journey, this must have been my very first time on Wellington Station. In the post-war world, faced with increasing bus competition and with more people being able to purchase their first cars, newly nationalised railways strove to regain the railway's former stature. In 1950, Wellington still had a good level of services on the main line and still had all its local services that were still operating. So this was the layout of the station at the time, around 1950. And can I just point out the road leading there from the square to the station, then called Station Approach, now called Station Road. I've marked in red the main station buildings, and I've marked the platforms in pink, and the locomotive depot and its related buildings and the signal boxes are shaded in blue. Now this is what the station area looked like in around 1950. But things were soon to change. On the Much Wenlock branch, for example, the passenger service beyond Wenlock to Craven Arms ended in December 1951. Here's one of the last trains from Wellington through Much Wenlock to Craven Arms. And 5 months later, in May 1952, the trains from Wellington to Coalport ceased. Again, there's a picture of one of the last trains from Wellington to Coalport. Government unease at the increasing financial losses made by the railways, coupled with its road transport bias, which led to a programme of motorway construction, this led to the savage cuts to rail services made in the Beeching Report of 1963. But even before that was published, 2 more local services were withdrawn. That from Wellington to Much Wenlock in July 1962. And there's one of the last trains from Wellington to Much Wenlock. And the service from Wellington to Market Drayton and Crewe in September 1963. Last trains from Wellington to Market Drayton. And then finally, the service that was directly recommended for closure in the 1963 Beeching Report was that which served the local stations on the Shrewsbury, Wellington and Stafford line. This shows one of the last trains on that service, which closed to passengers on the 7th of September 1964. But even that wasn't the end of it. Yet more changes occurred before the decade was out. While electrification of the West Coast Main Line between London, Euston and Glasgow was being undertaken in the early 1960s, mainline services between Wolverhampton High Level, Birmingham New Street and Euston were switched to the Great Western Route from Wolverhampton Low Level and Birmingham Snow Hill to Paddington. And this now provided an enhanced service which passengers to and from Wellington enjoyed. But with the completion of the electrification scheme in the mid-1960s, through trains to London on the Great Western Route were withdrawn, and passengers from Shrewsbury, Wellington, heading for the capital in London, had to change either at Wolverhampton High Level onto a train such as this, or they went on and changed at Birmingham New Street. Ironically, this was the original intention way back in 1849, when the Shrewsbury and Birmingham Railway was intended to actually link up at Wolverhampton High Level and Birmingham New Street. It had to wait until 1967 for that to actually happen. Since 1967, the regular train services on the line through Wellington have been provided by diesel multiple units operating from Birmingham New Street via Wellington and Shrewsbury to either Chester, Aberystwyth or Holyhead. Remember these rather well-decorated local diesel multiple units on this service a few years back. There was initially a daily through express service to Euston, but when this was withdrawn, the popular Wrexham and Shropshire service to London at Marylebone was operated between 2008 and 2011. Again, you may remember what those particular trains looked like. Only lasting from 2008 to 2011, and much missed. And in more recent years, there was a restored daily service from this area to Euston, provided by Virgin Trains and its more recent successor. And that's what the Virgin service looked like up until about a year or two ago. In line with the national trend, partly the result of road congestion and parking restrictions, all these services have seen a remarkable increase in rail travel. Until the opening of Telford Central Station in 1986, Wellington continued to attract the largest number of rail travellers in the area, and it still boasts the third highest passenger numbers in the county. Royal visitors to the area travelling by rail originally arrived at Wellington Station, as we saw with Princess Marie Louise in 1909. And in 1972, Prince Philip came to Wellington Station on his visit to Mallesley, Blisshill and Madeley Court Centre. And there's a picture of Prince Philip having got off the train into a car on his way off to the town centre. That was 1972. But after 1986, Telford Central Station was used by royalty visiting the area, as with, for example, the Queen and Prince Philip's visit in 2003. The opening of Telford Central Station in 1986 also had another impact on Wellington Station. Originally, the station was originally named simply Wellington. It became Wellington Salop in 1951, then Wellington for Telford in 1963, then Wellington Telford West in 1986, before finally reverting to its original designation, simply Wellington, in 1994, which of course still has that designation. Today, Wellington Station is still the gateway to and from the town. It's well maintained and now carefully looked after by a very keen friends group. And a group of them sitting and standing in front of the rather nice small garden they've made adjacent to platform 1 in the station. Apart from the impact of the pandemic, the station is well used and has a good level of services. Let's hope that this continues and the station remains the gateway of the town. So finally, coming back to those crosses which I mentioned at the beginning. marked with arrows on this photograph. The railway was built in a cutting through the centre of the town. And you can see its level well down below the buildings, the station in the bottom right hand corner. So it was built then in a cutting through the centre of the town. And although it's not clear if any graves were disturbed in the adjacent All Saints churchyard, which you can see towards the top right hand part of the picture, but it's not sure if any graves were disturbed in that churchyard. It's claimed that the two crosses that surmount the main station building, as I said, marked by those arrows, you can see them just right in the picture, it's claimed that those two crosses on the main building reflect that one on the tower of the church. If you look carefully, there is one on the tower of the church that those crosses reflect. But it's claimed that they were put there as a mark of respect. So, can I finally indicate my thanks to the following people for help with the images of this presentation. And can I also thank you for joining me in this presentation. So thank you very much.